Right, to get started, I took on this presentation from Sean Rabbit. He's been doing this for many years in the past. I'm a very poor stand-in for Sean. I'm going to try my very, very best. He is a great presenter, but he and I worked on this presentation a bit, and I'm very excited to share what we're going to be talking about here today. So a couple things just off the bat. Little forward-looking statements. There are some things we're looking ahead at, like not necessarily for Jamf, but for a lot of vendors out here, so just be aware, standard procedure stuff. Now, all that being said, it would not be a presentation without AI this year, but I promise you, I only used really lame AI images, no mention of AI LLMs and that sort of stuff, so you will see really bad images throughout, starting with this one. So, identity on the Apple platform is truly in hyperdrive. I'm looking at the audience here. It is a full house. And I think the reason for that is because identity really is the next frontier of the Mac admin. If you look at what is happening in the Apple ecosystem and in the world in general, you'll see that there's kind of two aspects that are happening here. We have endpoint management, which we all know and love very, very well here with this group, but also endpoint identity is becoming a very important part. And these two are becoming intertwined. And we'll go through some history of how all this has evolved. This is going to be a lot of information, by the way. I even put, as you'll see, little slide numbers on the bottom because that's going to go into triple digits here. And if you want to take notes of the slides, these will be available to you so you could reference them later. Of course, will be recorded as well. So to that end, I want to start with just kind of some of the fundamentals of identity. There's basically two main characteristics of identity I want to cover today. There's user identity and device identity. We'll get into why you can't have one with the other, but I'm going to just kind of go through those individually. So starting with user. It's a creaky stage. So user identity, so let's start with the definition, right? User identity is the unique digital representation of a user that enables authentication, authorization, and access control within a system. We mostly all know that, but if we really start to parse that apart, we'll understand what that means. And one of the other things I'll say about user identity, I'm sure you guys recognize this as well, it is one of the most nuanced, complicated things that is out there. It's like, oh, it's just a username and password. No, it's way more than that, right? And as you'll see through this presentation, there's many, many layers. There's a lot of complexity. There's a lot of pitfalls. So while the definition makes a lot of sense, there's so much depth to go. So to start off with, there's a user principal name, a UPN. We'll talk about that a couple times. You have Bob at company. Bob is your user. Company is your domain, typically. It's within a certain context. Now, usually when we talk about user identity, we care a lot about how you authenticate them. All of you know this is MFA. Something you know, a password or PIN, something you have, like a FIDO key or a certificate, and something that you are, like biometrics, so Face ID, Touch ID, those sort of things. Now, combined, the more of these you use, the stronger assurance that you've authenticated that actual individual, that person that we're talking about. I'm not going to get into the whole agentic user stuff in this conference. We're not even there yet as an industry, but that is going to be a next frontier of how you define people who are kind of surrogate or delegates of an actual user. That's a whole nother industry or a whole nother thing. So user identity on Mac is asserted at two levels. I've broken it down into the OS level and then browsers and apps. So if we go ahead and we start with the OS level, you ultimately, at the end of the day, have a password or a smart card that you use for that user authentication. That is just baked into the operating system, has been something there for a very long time. And the reason why it's there at the end of the day, besides all the other stuff that you have to do, is because if you're an enterprise, you're using File Vault. And that File Vault key is unlocked with a password or a smart card. There's just no getting around that. If anyone tells you otherwise, that you could do truly passwordless at the File Vault, they're either asking you to turn off File Vault, which is bad time, or they're just stuffing passwords in there. True passwordless at the operating system level is something that is not there, that is supported by Apple. So if you do try to get a passwordless experience, it's just, I think Joel put it best, you're kind of playing with fire in this area. So that being said, the password is still a very important area for you to be able to manage. So, and passwords are ripe with problems. I mean, I know probably this group runs into those all the time. I forgot them. I don't know, I can't reset them. They're on a password reset cycle from your identity team, and they time out. All the pain, help desk tickets, user frustration, all those things. So the history of this has been, well, we obviously just should keep that password in sync, right? So there's been a long history of trying to keep this. And by the way, this desert theme is AI generated, and it's like I'm showing that you'll see we start in a desert, we end up in space, and probably didn't have to explain that, but anyway, it's you start off with this whole idea of you have this like kind of this corporate directory that you want to keep that user identity synced with, including their credentials and passwords. So we started the whole thing with this idea of network accounts and AD binding to Microsoft Active Directory because it works on Windows, right? And it's like it works. You can get it to go, but it's it's tough. So the world's moved on. We saw some things where it's like, well, you know what? The local macOS account is a bit of a better user experience. There's a lot going for it. So let's keep that local user account in sync with your cloud identity provider. That was kind of also happening at the same time, moving that way. So we ended up with these third-party login enhancement tools where you're able to do just-in-time account creation and password synchronization. And those tools are taking over the login window to help you with that whole process. Now, some of those tools include, started with Nomad, with an open source tool that started this whole thing, and then other products that come along the road to help out with this. Because it is such an astute problem on the platform of making sure passwords are staying synchronized. So this is something that the industry and I'm sure all of you have probably dealt with one, if not multiple, of these products and are using them at scale. So to get an idea of what this looks like, you open up a brand new Mac, you get an enrollment customization during account-driven enrollments. You log in with your identity provider. You get through some of the initial processes. You can customize some of the things you see here. Then you finish setting up the Mac, and what ends up happening is instead of getting that user account creation screen that's default, in a lot of flows we see that you just end up creating a new account using some specialized method of that vendor that is being used. So you can customize the screen, you can do this stuff, and again, I showed Jamf, I happen to have access to that, but there's a lot of other tools that do the same thing, right? And the principle is the same. Get the password in sync, set up that local macOS account with a username that is structured correctly, that works on Mac, but also is using a password that is in sync with the IDP, lessening the chance of the user forgetting their password and having different passwords and that sort of stuff. So then you can see, then over time, like in the Jamf world, you use Self-Service Plus in this case, or Jamf Connect to keep your password in sync. Again, other tools do the same, and you can see here that it is just keeping the password in sync. Now, this is something that third parties have created to keep that password in sync. They're using all sorts of programmatic methods to make that happen, and it works. And and that is pretty much where we're at today. So that's on the OS side. On the browsers and apps side, what ends up happening is it's a different world. And for the longest time, you've had this idea that you would just use a browser, you would log in with your IDP credentials, and you would just have this kind of browser cookie-based SSO. So as long as you were in the same browser and as long as you were kind of everything was playing well together, it would work. But if you hopped on over into Slack or you hopped on over to a native app, you were logging in all over again because that session cookie that is being used for your IDP is stuck in the browser you were using. So the idea is as I have deal with it, it was a security way of doing it. It was actually pretty good. You could use push notifications to your phone. That's great. But then Apple came around and they introduced something called single sign-on extension. And this is something that allows the identity providers to go through and create an extension that actually just kind of takes that session cookie, takes it out of the browser, and puts that at a system context. And it's managed by the identity provider, so they actually take control of all those session communications, so they can actually say, okay, if I'm in Safari, or I'm in Chrome, or I'm in Slack, or I'm in Zoom, whenever there's a login event that has to happen, I can intercept that communication, share that I already know who this user and device is, get an access token for that app, log you in. And it's pretty great. You're able to do that. So to kind of give you a visual, you can even use things like Touch ID for that, where you go through, you get you log into something, you just get a prompt like this. And to give you again from the a video here, I'm logging into an application that is powered by Okta in this case. I use my Touch ID, and I'm able to get in, and I log straight into my applications. Super seamless, no passwords to type. It's a great existence, and also, of course, works on Entra. Have some things where we talk about that as well. Works to give you an idea of the native app. So if I had done that in Safari, in previous worlds, I'd have to log in all over again. But here, because it's using single sign-on extension, it recognizes I'm logging in with my account again. All I do is fingerprint Touch ID, and I'm off to the races. And even my things like my native mail app is able to get provisioned and bootstrapped, and I didn't have to type in any password. So it is a pretty cool technology that has been like kind of the foundation of that like kind of browser and app kind of communication there. Same thing on phones. It's a shared service that works across multiple OSs. So in this case, Face ID, I don't even get prompted for that. I just keep on looking at my phone and it logs me in. It's a great magical experience. So this is all out there today. If you're using Okta or Microsoft Entra, do check it out because it is game changing. Your users will love you. And your security teams will love you because these are biometric credential based like backed keys that are bound to the hardware. Like you could tell a great story. And again, it's one of those rare situations where you have a better security outcome and a better user experience. And it's all out there today. So highly, highly recommend checking that out from those two vendors. Now, we want to like keep on exploring, right? So our mission as humans is keep on going deeper into space, and so of course we do that, and that journey doesn't end there with what we got so far. And so what we have is this great platform of what the Apple overlords give us every once in a while, and in this case, what we get is platform single sign-on. So platform single sign-on has been all the rage. If you've dialed in at all this year about what's happening with OS 26, there's some great things here. But before we even dive into that, it's really important, I think, that we understand exactly what platform single sign-on is, where it fits, all those sort of things. So the way I kind of thought about this was that platform single sign-on kind of wraps that whole OS and browser and app experience into one. It really takes those two paradigms that were kind of operating separately and brings them together under one PSSO umbrella. And what ends up happening, the way it generally works, is you have your device management service, Jamf, Conji, Mosel, et cetera, Intune, push down an ESSO, that's an extensible single sign-on. The SSOE, ESSO, PSSO, there's a whole bunch of alphabet soup that happens in this stuff too. But like an extensible single sign-on profile gets pushed down to the device, as well as that IDP provider's app that has implemented platform single sign-on. So that lands onto the Mac. Now what happens is when I first boot up my Mac, or when I get into my desktop, I'll get a prompt to register my device to enroll it into single sign-on. And I'll show you some of the videos and what that looks like here. And that is actually an experience that's being powered by the IDP app. This is all something that is a framework that Apple has provided to identity providers to implement to allow you to for them to build this PSSO experience. But the very first way you get on-ramped as a user is you go through, you register the device, and then you authenticate yourself. What that does is that uses the platform's SSO APIs, way out of scope for this conversation, and really, again, only available to the IDPs. So this is all implementation details that we don't have to worry too much about, but we just kind of have to understand how this all works. It goes through some of the PSSO APIs, and what that ultimately does is returns a token down into that IDP application that is a PSSO token. Now, so that device is now registered, authenticated. This device, based upon your IDP, will show up as a registered device. It will show up as users. Like all the kind of magic has happened now. So that device is recognized by your identity provider and the user as well. So then when the user starts to do some logins, like we saw before, that same IDP app experience happens. You can use your Touch ID to be able to authenticate. And it then creates the connection over to your app and website, basically for simplicity, takes those tokens, allows you to get into the app that you were trying to log into, and it all just magically works. So, so that is working day in, day out. That is the main way that you're able to just use platform single sign-on. Again, an incredible outcome. You've got your device registered, you're getting those applications, and every once in a while those tokens will expire. And so what happens is during a login, when you log into the device or some time to live exceeds, there's a refresh process where, again, the user's prompted for their biometrics or the passcode. They go through, they type in they provide that information, and then they get some updated tokens, and the process goes on and on. So that's PSSO like in a nutshell. Now, a big question that comes about from this is like, well, what about the password? Remember, we can't get away from the password. We're talking about Touch ID. We're talking about like passwordless sort of stuff. But at the end of the day, there is always a password on the Mac or a smart card. So what about that password? How do you deal with that? Now, there's two ways that Apple has implemented passwords within Apple, and each are different strategies that you get to choose between based upon your users, your security requirements, the state of your identity provider. There's a lot to kind of unpack here and figure out. But the two modes are password and setback key. So secure enclave processor back key. Now, the password mode is pretty much what we know and love, today with all of our third-party tools that we have. It allows you to do this whole PSSO exchange, but the OS will actually keep the passwords in sync instead of relying on a third-party tool to do that. So it uses that PSSO protocol API to make sure that my password on my local Mac account stays in sync with my IDP process. Now, the way that Apple does it is a little different than the other tools, but it is native, and it does actually fulfill the actual end need. You could unlock that password still with Touch ID. So even though it is still syncing a password, your users really have a great experience of unlocking their Mac with their Touch ID and then being able to go into specific applications, and then they get logged into everything. So to kind of give you an idea of what that process looks like, after I've created my local Mac OS account, I'm able to go through, I get this pop-up here, in this case with Okta, where I go through and I'm prompted for single sign-on registration. I type in my local Mac account password to kind of authorize this process. I get prompted with a window where I go through and I type in my organization's IDP username and password. I could even do multi-factor, so if I want to be able to authenticate with my phone, in this case, I can get a push notification. Accept that. I'm almost there at that point because I've now authenticated the user. It's registered the device in the back end. The last step is you get one more prompt that says, hey, can you please sign in with your new password, your IDP password, show that this is all working, and then what that does is it keeps the password in sync now. You've now made sure that your Mac password is synced with your IDP password, and the user's all ready to go. So it's all set. So then that's it. So then that entire flow from that point on of like logging into apps and so on is now managed by PSSO and the IDP's app. And in system settings, you can go check out the user's local account, and you see there at the bottom, there's that platform single sign-on. You can see the method is password, the device is registered, and tokens are all good. So there's a whole bunch of stuff for another discussion probably next year where you can actually go in and like look at the PSSO tokens, analyze all that sort of stuff. But for the overview today, this is a good place to start. Now, the other one that I think is super interesting is secure enclave-backed keys. I was super confused about this one for the longest time because of how is it not a password? Like, I don't get it. How is this supposed to work? Now, I finally think I understand it and, want to share it with you guys here today. So it is the secure enclave-backed key is basically a new key that is a digital key or token created by the operating system. It's actually derived by that secure enclave processor that's on the device. Now, it is basically a surrogate for your password. It is something that is only on that device. You can never export it. It's burnt into the hardware. You're not able to export that to another device. You still have to have a local password. It doesn't have to be your IDP password. And that is a really, really important distinction. The point here is you need to have a password that's strong enough to fit your organization's security profile to unlock that local Mac. But the idea is that's something you can remember. But instead of it being a really memorable password that is easily phishable, what you're doing is you're just making it easy for the user to unlock their local Mac, but then you're using this really complex, impossible to remove, like highly secure token for all those PSSO operations that are happening behind the scenes. So the idea is, we'll get to a little comparison later, but that's the biggest difference here. And again, you have the same user experience where you could unlock those tokens with a Touch ID or password. So here's what the experience looks like with Entra that's using a setback key. So you go in here and you get the same prompt to register. You get a very similar view here. You'll notice one little difference is you don't have the password sync thing because it's using a setback token. You just are going to authorize the process. This process, I believe, actually will create that setback key. So you're showing that you have access to the secure enclave by authenticating with Touch ID. You're now going to log in with your Entra account where you go through, log in username and password. They also support MFA if you want to do that. That's all possible within this. But this is how you register that initial device. They go through an extra step of providing a passkey within the company portal as an authenticator. Now, there's a lot of nuance to this. I think we'll talk about it later, there's a session that Michael's doing later that if you want to really dive into some of these things, you can. I got the insight from Michael on this one over at Microsoft that this key is really useful for situations where those platform single sign-on tokens have either kind of like half expired, or there are certain like workflows where this is just a great additional thing to have to make sure that you could log in reliably into all of your organization resources if something happened with the underlying key. But for the most part, the platform single sign-on tokens that are kind of built in this process cover like 99% of all the use cases. So it walks you through actually adding company portal as an authenticator. Now you're allowed autofill from multiple apps, both personal as well as company portal, so that gets added in here. The user is prompted to turn that on. You're told, yes, go ahead. And then your registration is complete. So the differences, kind of as I mentioned, it's one password to remember for everything Mac on the password side. It's your IDP password. It stays in sync. There's a very narrow window where that password is maybe different. The whole idea is if you're in a password vibe, that's the way you keep on going. Now the problems with it, it's usually hard to type. You have complexity in the password, lots of characters. It's something that, a lot of security teams still have opinions about that. At the end of the day, a password is phishable. I could get called up with I can get vished, which by the way is very much on the rise right now, of like someone emulating your help desk, trying to get you to like give up your credentials. That's happening all the time. So it is a phishable credential. And at the end of the day, that alone doesn't satisfy MFA requirements. So other vendors that are supporting this, they're adding additional step-up authentication within their ecosystem to make that work. And that is actually very secure in those instances, but just natively by itself, the password sync alone is not MFA in a lot of definitions. Now, for the Secure Enclave, you end up in this very interesting conversation where it's a different password on the Mac. One could argue it's a PIN. You could draw a lot of similarities to something like with Windows Hello for Business. The idea is this is a very interesting space where you could actually set a password policy that is reasonably secure, like no simple codes, 6, 8, 10 digits, maybe alphanumeric, something that you could put on your users. But again, something that's complex enough that is going to allow that user to make sure that they create a sufficiently complex password, but not so simple that it's just if someone finds a laptop, they'll just be able to get in. This is complemented by the fact that Mac has a lot of anti-hammering sort of techniques built in. So you really, on aggregate, only get like 30 attempts at a password before that device locks itself down completely. So really, a lot of the idea of what a password means on a Mac is a very interesting conversation right now. I would encourage you to go to Michael Epping's session a little bit later today about this thing, because it is a very interesting conversation about what's happening, how this is evolving with a thinking about passwords versus enclave-backed tokens and passkeys and passwordless and all that stuff. Okay, so, but wait, there's more. I told you there's a lot going on here. So this is where we're looking a little forward-looking. This is where there's some interesting stuff coming our way. Again, some of these things are subject to change, potentially a lot. So, take that all into consideration here. So as we look into platform single sign-on today, being able to make that work requires, you notice that kind of jarring user experience. There's a lot of like hand wavy, well, I was already at the desktop and I got this notification and the user actioned it. Like there was a lot of stuff that had to happen for the user to get themselves into a position to even use platform single sign-on. And built into the operating system, there's no just-in-time macOS account creation for one-to-one devices. You are still reliant on something like a Jamf Connect or Passport to be able to create that initial just-in-time, that initial macOS account, and then be subject to platform single sign-on. Now, interestingly, last year, if you have a shared like Mac environment, like with a computer lab, there are ways to do just-in-time local account creation using your IDP username and password, but we didn't quite talk about that today. But this doesn't exist practically for one-to-one. And then the other challenge that we see is you cannot natively force biometrics, so you can always fall back to passwords. Now, what's exciting about this year is it appears that like 2 of those challenges are going to be solved. And this is super exciting stuff because it really will change the game, I think, of what of getting identity to be a durable component to the initial onboarding of a Mac that sets the stage for everything else that's to follow. So a new user experience could look like something where you have you boot up a Mac, you have a device management process. Now, what's really cool is you're actually able to get challenged for single sign-on right as the very, very first thing that you see in Setup Assistant. So let me say that, repeat that. Like before you actually do anything else, you are getting challenged for your IDP username and password. Now, what happens as part of that is you're registering the device securely. Now, you could do something called a silent registration that's using device-attested identifiers. We're going to talk about device attestation next, so hold that thought. But what's really cool about this is while you see the little spinner going, you could potentially have a fully registered, attested device within your IDP, showing up there. So then you're prompted to log in with your credentials. Now, this is where you actually type in your username and your organization's username and password. So you do that, or you could also opt to do a smart card if you have that, if you're into that sort of thing. But then this is your password where you're synchronizing that with your IDP. Then, once that has all happened, that's when enrollment actually begins into your MDM. And that's when you've fully authenticated the user, you've registered the device with your identity provider, again, ideally using an attested back key, and you're now enrolling that device into your MDM. And then you are actually creating a local native macOS account using those credentials that you had typed in before. Now, this is where there's a little nuance here, and this is actually super important. If you are using a password type PSSO, that field is locked. You can't change the password. You just proved yourself that you were able to log in with the IDP. We created a local macOS account with that password. That password is now set. We're not going to let you change it and mess yourself up and think that that has happened. So the idea is it's locked in there, and then that is your initial password. Again, if your IDP changes the password in some future state, you'll be prompted to type in the new password when that happens every once in a while. If it's an enclave-backed key, this is where you type in a password of your choosing. Now, ideally, you've pushed down a passcode policy of sufficient complexity, so you can't do, test 1, 2, or 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. You're able to actually provide a reasonable password, and that is where you do that. Now, what's super cool about this is the idea is that a local macOS account will be created that has user channel abilities for MDM. So that actual local macOS account is free to use all the modern cool declaration stuff that's coming that is user channel oriented. So this local macOS account can fully take care of that, which is sometimes a challenge for some of the other local password replacements or local login window replacements. And then, as if you couldn't get more, you have sign in with your local Apple account. Now, managed Apple accounts are something that you could actually do here as well. And the idea is because you've now bootstrapped platform single sign-on, you have tokens that can log you into your stuff. Now, if you've set up your local managed Apple accounts in a federated capacity with that same IDP, you're just going to get logged right into that as well. You're going to see a little pop-up, potentially. Again, don't know the UX exactly yet, but you're going to see. You're not going to have to type in your password again. You're not going to have to do a push notification, anything, because you've already logged in. It just uses those tokens to then bootstrap that managed Apple account onto that Mac, associated with that local Mac account, and then you're taken to the desktop. Now, did someone say managed Apple accounts? Like, I cannot stand up here and not talk about identity on the Apple platform without talking about managed Apple accounts. Now, for those that don't know it, these have had a journey, a storied past. They were known as managed Apple IDs or MAIDs for the longest time, started off in education. Apple has very much taken a lot of focus of that and brought them towards the enterprise. You see, like almost every year, you're seeing more and more capabilities that were only available for personal Apple IDs come to managed Apple accounts. So there's definitely parity being come there, and you don't have to squint too hard to see that that is a strategic direction of Apple, of where they're headed, to be able to support identity on their platform. A big part of that is how you federate these things with your organization. So a couple points about these managed Apple accounts. Man, I love Gen AI. So it's owned by an organization. It is like a normal Apple account, but you just don't have all the extended iCloud and media services, at least yet. So one of the big notable ones is you can't actually use a user licensed app store with a managed Apple account. But if it's a managed device, you use device-bound VPP tokens. So, what's not really a huge deal if in those cases, in a lot of cases. In some situations, not so much, but in a lot, you have an option around that. You use domain claimed by an organization, so you would claim company.com. You would then federate that with your IDP using an ABM setup. We'll talk about that in a second. I do have this due today, lock your domain. I'll talk about that here in a second, because you want to be able to lock your domain to your organization, so you're not making some of the situations worse where people continue to create personal Apple IDs with your company domain. The idea here is before you do a federation, you could lock it pretty risk-free and be able to prevent your whole from getting worse of having to do that. We'll talk about that in a second. IT can control iCloud, iMessage, FaceTime services, so very powerful for corporate-owned devices. That's very useful. And also, the use of managed Apple accounts can be limited to managed and supervised devices only. So idea is, if I have a personal device and I try to log in as a fully authenticated user of the organization, I can't do that on my personal Mac. The idea is it has to be a managed Mac or a supervised Mac, and there's configurations and integrations that Apple's done with AXM, with MDMs to be able to support that. It's called access controls. So within ABM, you have a configuration where you're able to specify many domains that you own. In my example, I have Jamf Autos. And as I was mentioning a second ago, before I get to that, I added this yesterday. I was talking to Nathan, who's doing this session. Another call out for a session, bring your own IDP to ABM. This is where he's going to talk quite a bit about managed Apple accounts, how to set that up with Okta and other OIDC-based identity providers as well, where you could tie that into your AXM. But the idea is you verify your domain using DNS mechanisms. What I would say here is lock your domain. It's a nice little switch. You just flip the switch, lock the jamfautos.com domain. So now if you were to go and try to create a managed Apple, before I did this presentation, you could have done, created your own personal Apple ID against this domain, but now you can't. It's going to say you have to have a managed Apple ID that is, configured within this AXM account to be able to use that domain. And again, the whole idea is that in order to do federation, and what that means is when I log in with a managed Apple account on a Mac, I want to use my identity provider for that authentication. Now, the way you do that is through a process called federation. And what is a prerequisite is that you have to set up federation. I think I have it on a previous slide, where you sign in this case with TriJamf Okta. The idea is I have set up federation where ABM acts as like an OIDC application, like it treats Okta or Entra or your IDP as like the authority for that account domain. So if I go into a browser, Apple ID or Apple account or account.apple.com, and then I type in something that's at jamfautos.com, I'm actually going to get redirected to an Okta login or to an Entra login, and I have to authenticate from there, as opposed to managing the password locally in AXM. Now, this is again very important because now you're using one username, one corporate directory source for all your managed Apple account logins. Okay. So there were some things that were challenging with that. It's like to be able to set up that authentication, that federation, you had to claim all squatting personal Apple accounts that were on your domain. So there's been a process to get them off. Some of the improvements that are supposed to come in the not too distant future is you can actually get a list of those users that are there, so you could actually reach out to them and help migrate them off of that. That's been a long time pain for a lot of customers. It's not available. Yeah, this is not available. But sorry, go ahead. Maybe during questions, let's do that. Yeah. Okay. App developer account login support, including CLI apps. There's some improvements that are coming on that front, and limit device setup to Apple accounts only. So this is actually super exciting for me because we have a lot of customers who say, I have a corporate-owned asset. I want to only allow managed Apple accounts that I control on that device. I don't want a personal Apple ID to be able to log into a corporate device. That's been a big problem because of DLP and those sort of things. With all the infrastructure that's been set up now, it is totally possible, or it will be possible, to lock down to that manage Apple account so that during that setup phase that you saw, you can make sure that if I try to change that username and I used a gmail.com account or something, it would not actually let me through that process. So you're able to lock down to a manage Apple account, which is a huge, very, very important for some organizations, not at all for others. So, but it is a capability that's coming. So what does the actual UX look like at the end of all of this? So in the case of using PSSO, I don't even get prompted to go in and type in my username. I just open up my various applications, like Teams is what I started up with. I go into Safari, I open up Microsoft, you see the brief trying to sign you in. Boom, signs you in without a username prompt or password. I could then go to my other apps. I could hit Outlook. That's going to load a new tab, log me in straight away from there. So it's an incredible user experience, and it's all tied together from the moment that device is unboxed is the direction of where we're headed. So again, we're right in the middle of all this stuff happening. It's still early days. There's still a lot to explore, but it's a very, very great user experience. So I have to say, so then what about all those Windows login enhancement tools we talked about? We've been using those for years. What does all PSSO mean for that? So I undoubtedly believe that this is the future of identity on the Mac. There's just no question about it. It's native, it's fast, it's being built, it's robust, it is just the way to go. Now, in it, there's clear investment in it. There's very exciting things happening. Now, the reality is it's going to take time for every organization to be able to fully understand exactly how PSSO works, how to implement it, how to migrate it. So the reality is I believe a lot of those login windows are going to be around for quite a long time while you still continue to figure this whole process out. Because again, identity is nuanced, it's complex, you're talking about user experience changes, you have a lot to think about and consider. So there's going to be a window of time where I think, we're going to see a lot of exploration in this case, but 10 years should be all PSSO. But between now and then, what does that journey look like? I think it's going to vary a lot by company, size, complexity, identity requirements. But the point is, I'm very excited about it, at least speaking on behalf of a vendor here, that it just allows us to now go solve the next problem. Like this was a gap in Apple's native operating system. Apple is closing that gap, making it killer, making it more competitive with Windows, allowing us to then go out and help build and solve the next challenge. So very excited about platform single sign-on. Now, don't have time to talk about all the other really cool stuff that is happening, and keep tuned on some of these items, but unauthenticated guest mode is one that is helpful for shared environments. Tap to log in and enter, so I'm kind of compounded two things. There's some really cool technology out there where you could use your iPhone as a badge to get into physical doors with HID readers and all that sort of stuff. That's available out there today. That's very cool. Tap to login is something that should be coming and is kind of tied to that other item. The idea is you could log into a Mac with your iPhone. Really neat, but a lot to figure out there. Managed passkeys, something that is available today. It is something where you could lock down passkeys just to your managed Macs. There's some ecosystem adoption that has to happen for that, but that is in the operating system. It's some pretty interesting stuff. PSSO macOS account privileges. There is actually in PSSO today, for a few years, the ability to specify what groups and what rights a given user should have when using platform single sign-on. So you can actually say they can change their Wi-Fi, but they can't change the system clock, or those sort of things at the operating system level. There's quite a bit we could do, the industry can do there. Again, as an unmet opportunity at this point. And then shared signals framework is a really exciting part of just identity in general, where you have all these identity providers and other kind of participants in the ecosystem that can share and exchange information about what they're seeing. For instance, if one vendor were to notice that an incident happened on a Mac endpoint, they could signal that to an identity provider. That identity provider can invalidate a bunch of access tokens, can do that to send that to Apple devices to log that user out of their managed account locally and clear data. Really exciting stuff that is kind of creating this whole ecosystem of identity. Told you it'd be a lot, guys. Right, okay, so that was user. And I promise device is shorter. It's a little bit more crisp, but yeah, the user area, very exciting. There's a lot happening there. But for me, device identity's kind of been the forgotten half of identity. There's so much important stuff that you could do from a security perspective when you really understand who the device is. So what is device identity? It's a unique, verifiable representation of a device used to establish trust and authenticate it. So, lost my connection there. Back to the laptop. Now, as I mentioned, this has been a challenge on Apple devices for many, many years. Oh, we're back. And the reason is a truly secure device identifier is difficult, if not impossible, to do on an Apple device, largely because of the privacy stance that Apple takes within their operating systems. That if us as a corporate, for managed environments or for organizational environments, if we can establish an identifier that can correlate a device and users, so can other sort of non-business use cases, right? Marketing, advertising, the sort of stuff that Apple is not looking to support or enable. So they actively shut down a lot of those sort of things. Now, what's been very interesting, we'll talk about that, is how they have addressed that problem. So the existing less secure methods that we see out there, like I didn't call them insecure because it's kind of the best way you could do it today, but they're less secure. You could plant an identifier on the file system somewhere. You can push down through MDM like a configuration that indicates a device identifier. You can do a self-generated UUID that is just random, and then you send that identifier out through your own private context. And you could also use certificates like P12 or SCEP certificates in limited capacities within libraries and those sort of things. Like there's ways to do it, but it isn't easy is the point. And in a lot of times we just see people fail over towards the items on the left because it's easier and the other stuff is really hard to do. But the question is, so how do we do this right? And yet again, Apple hath given us managed device attestation. So this is a really, really, really exciting technology for me, and I think for the industry, because it now acknowledges, like, look, we need to be able to identify this hardware and be able to cryptographically prove that it belongs to our organization, that it is something that is not just some random device that's out there, and it is a framework and foundation to do that. So what is it? It's an Apple platform security feature that provides hardware-based cryptographic evidence or an attestation of a device's identity and several core properties. So the way it generally works is when you go, and this is a very high level, estimation of how this works, but a new secure enclave processor is printed somewhere in an Apple factory somewhere, right? And that has a public key that is emitted to it in some sort of database. It's planted within an Apple device, and an association with a serial number and UDID of that physical hardware is made. The device is shipped to the customer. It is powered on, and then through the various mechanisms of attestation we'll talk about here in a bit, there's a request, a challenge response, and a handshake sort of process where the device is challenged to prove that it owns the private key that was burned in on the very far left there as part of its process to be able to get ultimately a certificate and some sort of identity for that device. Now we're going to dive into that in much more detail here. So how do we use it? So that all sounds great, but what are the vehicles to actually use device attestation? So there's 5. So MDM and DDM, Acme DA, device attestation certificates, network relay, platform single sign-on, managed apps. I'm going to dive into each of these in turn. So on the MDM side, there's something that was introduced within the device information query, where you could actually say, as the MDM vendor can say, hey, actually send me attestation information about that device. And what's really cool is the attestation certificates that come back in some leaf certificates, they get sent back in the payload response, that device information response in base 64 or something similar. It actually has some certificates with a full cert chain back up to Apple's attestation services with these values burned in as OIDs, which are extensions to the certificate. So there's some immutable values like the device's UDID, serial number, and software update device ID that, again, is in a part of a cryptographic certificate that is bound all the way to a root CA that Apple owns for their attestation services. And there's some mutable values. So like at the time that attestation request was made, what OS version was running, what SEP OS version. You could see like it was SIP enabled, secure boot. The platform will actually attest to those values, whereas before you could read those in through MDM, but they could have been manipulated. Like it was not actually like cryptographically verified by Apple that those settings were in a certain state, but that's exactly what is now offered here, which is incredibly powerful. So one of the things that you could do is say, well, and so what ends up happening is you basically get a device information query that goes to the device. It's done all this process with Apple's attestation services to get an attestation certificate that's on the device, and basically that just gets shipped back to the MDM, where the MDM can then parse that information and do really interesting things with it. So one of the things with Jamf Smart Groups, you could have on the last row there, attestation status is success. Like, did the attestation, like, were we able to analyze the attestation successfully? And are all those other criteria there? So if you wanted to establish a baseline for attestation, a smart group similar to this is something you could do. And again, this is not just a Jamf thing. Any MDM can do this. It is just part of the protocol. Okay, then the other big part is Acme device attestation certificates. Now the way this works, it's very much, I started with the technical flow, and we'll get into like some of the characteristics for how that goes, but this is actually, I think, very interesting to show how this whole thing works. So much like a SCEP certificate or other certificate type, you push an Acme mobile configuration profile to the device through the MDM channel or declaration. You have the hardware-bound private key within the secure enclave, like I mentioned, burned into the device. That device will go reach out to Apple's attestation servers with a bunch of characteristics signed by its own private key, and and Apple will verify the private key and do all the handshakes and say, okay, yeah, I know exactly who this device is, and I'm going to give you that attestation certificate with all those mutable and immutable values that I talked about. So that is in a certificate now on the device. Now, instead of that going to the MDM like I showed earlier, what actually ends up happening is an Acme request is sent out to an Acme CA of your definition that actually includes that attestation certificate and the whole cert chain as part of that Acme request. Now, what you can then do on the Acme CA side is you could validate that cert chain is accurate and is actually issued by a trusted Apple root CA. And if that's the case, then you could trust all those OIDs in there, which includes things like the serial number and UDID. So then your CA can turn around and say, well, it could do that, but then, important point, is it gets that stuff, it validates that it's signed by Apple, but to avoid man in the middle and kind of replay attacks, what ends up happening is a WebAuthn challenge happens, where actually the device will say, hey, I need you to solve this challenge and prove that you actually have the private key within this device, and that someone's not impersonating it, you're not doing a replay attack, not a man in the middle, that sort of stuff. So it's actually doing an interactive WebAuthn session with a device, which is incredible, and it was very super cool for a certificate enrollment process. And if that passes, you get a regular old X509 certificate. You can include as many or as few characteristics of that attestation certificate as you want, but you ultimately get an X509 cert issued by that CA, not issued by Apple, issued by the CA. The CA is responsible for trusting the certificate issued by Apple, and then the CA issues its own cert chain. But then that certificate goes in the keychain. Whenever you need to use that identity, Apple does all the magic behind the scenes, so you still cannot ever access the private key as an application, but the OS can. And it is able, so for these system services like VPN, Safari, Wi-Fi, Relay, you're able to use that certificate exactly as you do today, which is super portable, super cool that it all just kind of plugs in. It's not a huge migration. It's all just stuff behind the scenes, but it is using a new certificate authority type. So some of the main benefits of this whole Acme DA certificate bit is, these private keys, they are hardware bound. And that means they're not accessible, exportable, viewable. Like you go, if on a Mac or you try to go on a keychain, just blah, it doesn't work. You can't do anything there. So so the private keys just totally behind lock and key, can never be exported. No one can access them. You get some those properties that are tested by Apple. Those immutable and mutable properties that otherwise you can get, but you can't necessarily trust with such high assurance. And then they're usable just like other certificates. So one important thing, as I've come across as I've talked to customers and other partners in this space, is this kind of general confusion that if you go to your CA and say, do you support Acme? They'll say, yeah, of course I do. But the right question is, do you support Acme device attestation? And then they'll all look at you like, what are you talking about? Because it's still very, very early days for that sort of thing. And the reason is because Acme device attestation is actually an extension to the Acme protocol. Acme is usually used for web servers. It's like what Let's Encrypt uses and all that sort of stuff. But what Apple has done with some folks at Google and other teams is they've actually built this device attest 01 standard, and that is actually doing that web auth challenge. So what you need to look for are vendors that will support the Acme DA process, not just Acme itself. So one of the main use cases that I'm most excited about as I, again, talk to customers and all those other folks is like just how profoundly amazing this can be for Wi-Fi. I mean, the amount of pain I see customers go through just to get their devices on enterprise Wi-Fi is incredible. You have, not to mention, it's like there's a bunch of security issues with static dynamic secrets, SCEP set up, either in the clear or all sorts of funny things. Like there's a lot happening there. ADCS, proxies, legacy infrastructure, implicit device IDs, like where you're trusting your MDM to say, well, this the MDM query information told me the device is this value, so therefore I'm going to push that into my SCA, and I'm going to trust that no one bad in that whole process like modified that identifier. And it's just all sorts of, like, not wrong because that's just where we're at, but like it's such a big improvement. It just makes things so much easier, because what you could just do is you say, hey, when a device comes online, give them this Acme CA, this Acme mobile config profile. You don't have to assert any identity. The device asserts its own identity, and as part of that process, what you end up doing, what I've seen some vendors do, they'll actually tie their Acme CA to the MDM, and when they see that attestation certificate come through with that UDID, they say, hey, is that device registered in your MDM? And if so, go ahead and issue the certificate. And because we trust that you cannot impersonate that UDID, then it becomes a lot easier of a process to trust. Okay. Another thing I'm quite enthusiastic about these days is network relay. A relay is a special type of proxy that is optimized for performance, uses the latest networking, transport, and security protocols, and is natively built into Apple operating systems. You may be wondering, why am I talking about like relay and device ID? And I'll get there. So the point is, it's not a VPN, it's a relay, baby. And I think I dated myself with that reference. But there's a couple ways to get this going. Like you have, again, a relay is built into the operating system stack of all of these operating systems. It's just, there's no agent to put in there. It is built in. So you can configure it using an Acme and relay mobile configuration profile as one way. Now, what's super cool about it, you could also build an app if you want to have an app, or you could even set up relays at the NSURL session level. So within your application, you can create these relays that use this kind of proxy infrastructure, so you get extra security and assurances, and as we'll talk about device ID here in a second. So what ends up happening is when you hit a destination host name or domain that is encoded with that configuration profile, or within some of these other the ways you set it up, it actually creates a mask HTTP3 quick based tunnel to a proxy of your choosing. So you could host it, a service provider can host it, but what ends up happening is it creates a secure mutual TLS tunnel for just that traffic that you have communicated, and you can then have that be in the cloud. You can have it like do other sort of stuff on the back end, but the point is you've created this extremely strong tunnel that works for any TCP and UDP traffic, can be device-wide or per app based upon how you've set it up. Now, what's the super cool thing about this, and because I've worked with a lot of other companies trying to solve this problem by like doing TLS interception and cookie injection and all this sort of stuff to try to get a device identifier, you actually get that device ID within the MTLS client certificate that comes in to your proxy edge. So what that means is when you receive that connection, so what happens is you have that outer tunnel, you have your inner traffic that you're protecting. That outer tunnel actually has a certificate that is issued by, that managed and attested certificate. So you get the device identifier that you could parse on your proxy edge and say, hey, I know exactly which device this is. It's been proven and attested, and that allows all the traffic within that tunnel for you to attribute to that device that was identified on the outer tunnel. So it is a networking-based way for you to be able to build and understand device ID and use managed device attestation as a process to do that. So it's pretty cool technology that's kind of all built in. And again, you could do it potentially all agentlessly without any user authentication or intervention. It's all just done through MDM and configuration profiles. So what does it look like on the device? Just right within the configuration, you end up with the MDM configuration. You have the VPN and relay just show up. There's a way now to actually prohibit disablement, so you can make sure it's always locked on. This is for the device-wide MDM case. Again, you could write your own app where you use NSURL session where this doesn't show up at all. It's just using those relays for any sockets and connections it makes. And then the user experience is pretty cool. So if you just go into an app that doesn't have the relay configured, mysite.internal, for instance, doesn't load. You go through and you use your MDM to just go through and push a relay configuration. You just say deploy. Within a couple of seconds, you can go into your system settings on the device. And again, I'm showing here on mobile. It works on all those different devices. You get that relay that shows up there. You then can immediately go over, launch that same exact app, and you're in. And that is like within, and what it's done is it's used, again, that device attestation and those device identifiers to allow that access and make all that work. Okay, platform single sign-on. I talked about it a little bit before. This is actually introduced in 15.4. So this is not something that is new, but it's been talked about. This is where identity providers can use that device attestation certificate as their device enrollment identifier during PSSO registration. So that could be, again, in the post-user creation process or in that potential new process where you're able to basically use that attested certificate I talked about, the exact same certificate, all the characteristics, the IDP can use that to register and authenticate that device. Maybe say check against ABM, make sure that those serial numbers match within that ABM environment. There is a great opportunity where you're actually able to see, okay, yeah, this is actually an attested machine that belongs to my organization. I'm going to allow it to register. I'm going to then allow the user to authenticate versus letting any random Mac device in the world in that could be trusted just if you have the right credentials for the user. And then finally, managed app. Now this, I don't know how many, show of hands, who's heard about the managed app framework so far? Okay, good. It's brand new in like 18.4 or so, but it is a secure configuration framework that leverages declarative device management to install and configure apps on a managed device. Now, again, I look at this as much more than just device ID. This is very exciting when it comes to identifiers because I look at this as almost like app config 2.0. And one of the really cool things you could do with it is you could do identities, certificates, and secrets directly into your app. Now, it is iOS, iPadOS, and visionOS today, but what's incredibly cool is it has been impossible on a mobile device to be able to get a certificate delivered down from the MDM. Those certs that are delivered down from the MDM traditionally have only been available to system services, like I mentioned earlier, Safari, Wi-Fi, those sort of things. If you wanted a cert in your own app, you had to write your own library, you had to do your own thing to be able to do that. Now this, you can actually push a declaration with the managed app configuration and push down an identity into your application that only your application can read, and it is all done super secure. Like it is actually a secure app config, which is super cool because, again, it is something that's been missing. And ultimately, that actually gives you that device ID. So you can, because again, you have that certificate that is right there. You're able to read that certificate in. You could validate it. You could attest it. You get all the stuff. So you actually have this very strong device ID. And because your app and then someone else's app can use the same process, you all get that same device ID. You could all correlate signals and do all this sort of stuff. So you all have a common device identifier in a verifiable, secure way. So how do you use this? So you have an Acme certificate DDM asset that you configure with, like, for instance, like an Acme configuration payload. You then reference that within the app managed DDM dictionary. So you basically just, you can see company my Acme device ID is this asset that's being deployed, and then the identifier my device CA ID. Now what's super cool about this is you then go onto the Swift side into your application. This is all the code you need to get that identity. You basically just say, hey, I want to get this managed app identities provider. There's my identity ID, that my Acme device CA ID that I want. I then go through and I use this simple command to say, with this ID, give me the identifier, and I get a security identity ref available for my application to use that is that Acme certificate. So I can do whatever I want with it at that point. Again, if it's an Acme cert, I can't use the private key directly, but there's different libraries that Apple lets you use to be able to do signing services and other sort of stuff. So super, super cool that this is all being kind of coming together and building into the platform. Okay. I'm actually wrapping up. I'm going to be finishing on time. I can't believe it. So we covered user and device. Now, again, lots of content, lots of information, lots of really cool tech. But the question I get about this is like, why does your boss and your boss's boss's boss actually care about any of this? Because it is, again, really fun, really cool tech. And the reason is, like, at the end of the day, identity is at the core of all this zero trust architecture you hear about. And I believe it's a once in a decade IT paradigm shift that we see, and it's happening right now. And the whole idea of it is, you keep the bad guys out by building the trust before allowing any access. This is at the core principle of zero trust architecture. So all of these trends, all these things that we're seeing out there that your boss's boss's boss is thinking about, digital transformation of the cloud, cybersecurity, threat attacks, ransomware, agentic AI, all that stuff is all being driven. It will only be successful with a zero trust model, because if it's not using that, there's just so many holes and opportunity for things to go way wrong. We see hacks and ransomware all the time, and zero trust is really the principle, the architectural principle to solve that, and it's all anchored by a really strong cryptographic identity. Now, for us as Mac admins, this is really important because we have this role that tends to be towards that bottom. Where we're managing the endpoint, but you have all these different teams that are trying to solve these problems, and they're all doing it in this kind of abstracted sort of way. Like, everyone is just throwing an agent on there and trying to do these things, and they're just listening to one vendor about how to do one thing, and then the other vendor has another thing. The app team is not talking to the network team, and all this sort of stuff. So you end up with all sorts of implied trust, assumed trust, delegated trust, and none of that is zero trust. The whole principle is you are missing the whole point if there's anywhere in the whole process where you're saying, because I say that you have this identity, therefore you must be that identity. If you have that anywhere in the system, you do not have zero trust. It has to all be self-attested from the bottom up. So the idea is you can get rid of that whole abstracted model, and by providing the right principles and by providing the right core infrastructure and foundations with strong user identity, strong device identity, that identity infrastructure flows up. And what we're trying to do a lot with the ecosystem right now is work with the security providers, the identity providers, the app providers, security providers, to look at how Apple does user identity and device identity and adopt that natively and make that part of their stack. So you're using an attested managed certificate at the identity layer. So security vendors are using a managed device attested device ID when they're signaling between each other. So they're not just basing all of their threat intelligence upon a device ID that has been spoofed at the very bottom. Like, the whole thing, again, falls apart if you don't have that. So this is a really interesting, exciting time for us, I think, as Mac admins here. So my last point is I genuinely believe that Apple devices are zero trust by design. I think Apple has invested a ton of work in it. Thank you. A ton of work in this. It makes them a preferred vendor, a preferred platform by users, IT and security teams alike. Again, I think done the right way, done the way Apple's done things, implemented the right way by this team and by the vendors that are in MDM, but also in all those other adjacent spaces, you can have a really, truly incredible experience that is zero trust and secure by design. Whew, okay, well, made it through. So thank you for hanging there, and we have some time for QA. Okay, maybe we start, there was the comment earlier about, I have this catch box. There was a comment earlier about managed Apple accounts and not something I was maybe saying was wrong, time and availability.
All right, testing. So the statement that was on slide 93, which is about the list of accounts that Apple will provide to verified domain holders.
Sure.
It is apparently a common misunderstanding based on how it was presented, but the way that it's actually written is that they will only give you a list of accounts that have been used for certain services like the
Aha.
Apple Developer Portal or the Apple Push Notification Service and a couple of others that I don't recall right now. But it is unfortunately not yet a blanket domain-wide list of email addresses, which is something that I'm actually planning to talk to them about.
Okay. Good to know. So, the reason that's important is because those services tend to be the ones that like where you have problems with managed Apple accounts, right? And that's why they probably started with those when it comes to like legacy accounts and trying to find the ones that can be moved over. Is that about right? Why? I mean,
It wasn't a problem for us because we knew who all the key holders were and how to access those services, but I can imagine why it would be for other orgs.
Perfect. Yeah. Okay.
I have something to add to that because I was talking to an Apple employee just Monday about this, and the problem is personal privacy, which, as you know, goes all the way up to the top at Apple.
Yep. Sure does.
So the messaging right now is you shouldn't expect that
Okay.
for personal Apple IDs that have not been used for a managed service anytime soon. You should be sending a message out, because the goal is, right, you want to know who to message first before you try to capture a domain. And so the suggestion is you should email your whole entire fleet of all employees that if you happen to have an Apple ID, this thing might be coming.
Gotcha.
Because for the time being, we are not going to be getting a list of each and every Apple ID that has been used, only the managed ones.
Cool. Okay. Thank you. Oh, I can't throw that far. We'll relay it a little bit.
Who's got it?
Watch your waters.
Watch your chair, man.
Yeah. Nice.
Okay, so in the brave new Tahoe PSSO world, you have this brand new device. Get it out of the box and you're doing your initial login, PSSO is doing its thing, but you're in a PIV card environment, so you have to plug in a card reader, which normally when you plug in a new card reader, you get the little dialogue, hey, do you want to let this thing actually talk to your Mac?
Yeah.
So I see a potential for wedging the process if that's not, do you know if that's handled?
I actually don't.
Okay.
Definitely haven't tested that yet. I don't know if anyone here can comment to that, but
Okay.
I can't answer that right now. I don't know.
Because that's the thing I'm seeing is that could wedge the entire thing
Sure.
hardcore,
Yeah.
especially with the improvements to PIV in Tahoe and PSSO.
Yep. Yeah. Sorry, I don't know that one.
Okay.
Any other questions? Okay. Well, thank you again. Hope that was a helpful presentation. Again, there's a lot more to come and learn, I think, over the next couple of years. So thank you for your time.